So welcome everybody. It's wonderful to have you here today, and we're really thrilled to have the distinguished Giulia Sissa here. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge the country on which the University of Sydney and the University of Wollongong, as the kind of respective hosts of the Critical Antiquities Network and our workshop, sit. So we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of the University of Sydney, that being the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and for the University of Wollongong, we acknowledge the Darawal, the Yuin, and the Wadi Wadi peoples as the traditional custodians of the country in the Illawarra, and we respect and pay tribute to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that land was never ceded, ownership was never ceded, and we stand in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of Australia, and indeed beyond, that continue to suffer under the injustices of contemporary capitalism and the legacies of colonialism. But it's with great pleasure that we acknowledge Giulia Sissa and her presence here today. Giulia Sissa will be known to many of you. She is Distinguished Professor in the Departments of Classics and Political Science at UCLA. She was trained in France and in Italy and has held positions in Europe and also at Johns Hopkins University in the US before moving to UCLA. Giulia's research is anchored in the societies and cultures of the Greek and Roman world, but Giulia wonderfully connects that study to moments of reception, of recontextualization, and significant resonance in the modern world. Her work orients this study around major contemporary issues, including those of feminism, sexuality, addiction, democratic theory, utopian thinking, political emotions, and eco-criticism. So, of course, she's a good fit for the Critical Antiquities Network, to say the least. Giulia has published many significant works, and we definitely don't have the time to go through them all now. I trust that many people will already know her works, and for those who don't, I trust in your reliance on the power of Google to find them. I will just mention her most recent book, which I will do a great injustice in reading in French. The title is Le Pouvoir des Femmes, un défi pour la démocratie, which was published in Paris by Odile Jacob in 2021. And I eagerly await its translation into English for the sake of my brain power. So let me stop there and say thank you, Giulia, for being here, and we look forward to your paper, which is entitled Forget Sexuality, Sensuality in Ancient Erotic Cultures. Thank you, Giulia.
Thank you very much, Tristan. Thank you so much, Ben. I'm utterly delighted and truly honored to be part of the Critical Antiquities Network, at least today. So forget sexuality, not that we need love and that all we need is love, but let us start from there. In the contemporary Anglo-American world, love is either an emotion, a sentiment, a passion, which may or may not involve the physical aspects, or on the contrary, love is essentially a matter of hormones and other biochemical facts, the consequences of which are arousal, lust, or attachment. In ordinary language, we may loosely apply the general definition of a physiology to amorous life and thereby to the normal functions, quote unquote, of the sexual parts in living organisms. But the idea of a physiology of love has inspired more ambitious reflections. In 19th century France, Stendhal took up this formula, Physiologie de l'amour, on love, to brand the project of reconstructing the necessary moments of enamoration, from attraction to deep attention, idealization, and ultimately crystallization. Italian anthropologist and pathologist Paolo Mantegazza wrote an essay entitled Fisiologia dell'amore to make the case for the fundamental naturalness of human sexuality, the first volume of A History of Sexuality, to be followed by An Art of Love. Again, in the same idiom, a French writer and essayist, Paul Bourget, made a grand, albeit ironic, attempt to theorize what love had become for the modern man who, in his time, and more precisely in Paris, was not at all natural. Under the auspices of physis, namely of nature, these moral philosophers, psychologists, and erotographers try to classify recurrent patterns of desire, pleasure, displeasure, and passionate devotion. While never forgetting the body, they all looked far beyond procreation, anatomy, and the mere usage of the sexual apparatus. They were interested in the entanglement of the erotic between sentiment, seduction, sympathy, and the senses. In his own way, Sigmund Freud was tackling the same puzzle: the idealization of one particular person, the displacement of sexual aims beyond the genitalia, and the still genuinely erotic pursuit of those aims. Love is not something other than sex. Love is erotic. Now, we might ask ourselves whether any of these ideas have been significant in Greek and Roman societies. The answer must be nuanced. On the one hand, these remote erotic cultures were not alien to a specialized approach to the bodily aspects of love. Quite the opposite, ancient physicians cultivated an epistemically innovative research project about the body, and thus invented forms of authoritative knowledge based on observation and concerned with health and sickness. In the same vein, Aristotle produced a corpus of writings on the shape, the structure, and the functions of organs, limbs, and tissues. The genitalia of a variety of living beings, especially humans, are an object of inquiry, comparison, and description in the Hippocratic corpus, as well as in Aristotle's biological works. On the other hand, if we were to limit our attention to these explanatory accounts, we could only ask and answer a few questions, such as what the external and internal elements of the female and male reproductive tract are, why sexual difference should ever exist in the first place, how various manners of copulation take place, how sexual arousal occurs, and how sexual drive aims at different ends and different objects. Procreation would draw most of the attention. We would then disregard all the philosophical and fictional discourses that touch upon the rich reality of love in Greek and Roman society. Firstly, we would downplay the importance of love between partners of the same gender, be they females or males. Worse, we would miss an idea that is pervasive and central to every consideration of what love actually is in ancient erotic cultures: the idea of the lived body. Ancient thinkers and writers are truly concerned with what Paul Bourget identifies as feeling feelings, sentir sentir. More inquisitively, they care for what modern phenomenology has brought to the fore as the experience of living the body. Our own body is our own sensorial, postural, kinematic openness to the world. We are always aware of our corporeal being. This is recognizably true in the erotic situation, it goes without saying, as in Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception or in Jean-Paul Sartre's chapter on the caress, la caresse. In ancient fiction and thought, a lover's sensation are first and foremost visual and tactile impressions. I place myself in this venerable tradition to continue the kind of inquiries I have started a while ago with sex and sensuality in the ancient world. Early Greek poets give the tone by accentuating softness. Hesiod sketches the first known characterization of Eros. Immediately after chaos, earth, and Tartarus, Eros comes into existence. He is the most beautiful among the immortal gods, softener of limbs. Os Callistos en Athanatos Theoisi Lysimeles. And he overcomes the mind and wise counsels of all gods and all men within them. Handout number 1. Eros' superlative beauty in turn acts on human bodies. He mollifies the joints. He also disables the mind. Eros, the god, does not figure in the Homeric poems, but there are moments of erotic spell. And then what happens is precisely the physical effect of the Lysimeles. Men's joints go soft. When Penelope appears before her young suitors, they all wish to go to bed with her. Handout number 2. The knees of the suitors were loosened, indeed, thanks to Eros. And their spirit was enchanted, and they all prayed to lie beside her in bed. When Penelope herself finally recognizes her husband, handout number 3, her own knees and hurt loosen up. Then she breaks into tears, runs toward him, and throws her arms around his neck, kisses his head. They embrace, and now Penelope stares at him, unable to detach her white forearm from his neck. They also make love, but the poetic camera, so to speak, does not follow them under the sheets. It rather freezes on these gestures of tenderness and sensorial contact. This is what the poem chooses to frame. Something happens in the body, the knees go soft by themselves, and on that physical event, both women and men will act intentionally, sensually, that is. Now, iambic and melic poetry insist on the same kind of sensuality, but there it is the poetic ego who echoes the Homeric and Hesiodic paradigmatic experience of erotic titillation. But desire, the softener of limbs, my friend, overwhelms me. Allamo Lysimeles o etairo damnati pothos. This is what sings Archilochos of Paros. Like Hesiod's Eros, Pothos affects a lover with a pliancy which is paradoxically overpowering. The same poet, handout number 4A, goes as far as depicting one of the most graphic scenes of erotic intimacy in Greek fiction, out of comedy. I took the maiding of the Virgin and laid her down in the blooming flowers. With a soft cloak, I covered her, holding her neck with my arm. And with my hands, I gently took hold of her breast, where she revealed her young flesh, the approach of her prime, and caressing all her lovely body, I let go my white ? Force, menos, touching her blonde hair. Epidermic strokes, half nudity, and an emphatically non-penetrative male pleasure. If now we turn to Alkmann's poetry, handout number 4B, we encounter a performative situation in which Spartan young women dance and sing. Eros is both experienced and conveyed in words. One of the girls intones, and with limb-softening desire, Lysimele te posoi, she looks more meltingly than sleep or death, and not in vain is she sweet. With long feet and beautiful hair, as Tumeloisa holds a garland like a bright star of the shining heavens or a golden branch or soft down. The singer reveals that there is a radiant woman whose vision and whose gaze makes her thou. But the singer also laments Astimeloisa's unresponsiveness. If only I could see that she loved me, she hopes. If only she came nearer me and took my soft hand, Appalas Keros Libai. Immediately I would become her suppliant. Like liquefying looks, delicate touches, and unstiffened joints. Longing desire is felt as unnerving, loosening, unhinging, so to speak, no grabbing. On the contrary, these manners of being affected contribute to an erotic of the octative. The female lover says it all. The object of her desire is not the other person, but that person's own desire. And Astimeloisa's amorous response would manifest itself through the same kind of slow motions and gestures, such as coming close, and touching. In the register of softness, swiftness, delicateness, the physicality is there, together with the wishful thinking. Sensual desire keeps cohesion on hold. For the amazement of her later reader, Sappho, at the turn of the 6th century BCE, details her own multiple sensations. No handout here. He seems as fortunate as the gods to me, the man who sits opposite you and listens nearby to your sweet voice and lovely laughter. Truly, that sets my heart trembling in my breast, for when I look at you for a moment, then it is no longer possible for me to speak. My tongue has snapped at once, a subtle fire has stolen beneath my flesh. I see nothing with my eyes, my ears hum, sweat pours from me, a trembling sizes me all over. I'm greener than grass, and it seems to me that I'm a little short of dying. I quite like this translation. The phenomenal body in its purest expression. For Sappho, it is again Eros, the sweet bitter, glucupicron, the limb loosener, lusimeles, that makes the poet quiver. In the same register, Pindar, handout 4C, active, as we know, in the 5th century BCE, announces his sensitivity to any irresistible boy. Contrary to those who must have a black heart forged with cold fire out of steel or iron, he melts, takomai. He says so. He melts like the wax of sacred bees bitten by the heat of the sun. And this whenever he sets eyes upon the new limp youth of boys. Eros himself, Ibycus sings, handout 4D, by looking with melting eyes under his dark blue eyelids, utterly enchants the poet. Plutarch, in turn, will linger on this precise sensation, softening. The looks of boys in their bloom melt and dissolve the lovers with a pleasure mixed with pain. This they call sweet bitter, glucupicron. Erotic awakening is disabling, even de-virilizing. Greek poetry places a peculiar focus on both female and male sensuousness. The only anatomy that matters here is that of the joints responsible for a body's rigidity or of soft limbs. Arousal is relaxation. So, archaic poetry sets the stage for the Greek and Roman discourse on love, I will argue. Firstly, love is sensuality. The erotic event is desire, naming the pursuit not the use of pleasure. And the pleasure in question is that of the senses. To be sensual or sensuous means to pursue this kind of pleasure. Among the senses, there is touch, and touch is the essence of eroticism. Sensuality includes contact of the skin and the flesh together with the delights of all the other sense organs. A capacious attitude that encompasses all kinds of perceptions, sensuality is the overarching erotic experience. While it may well include coitus, which is merely a kind of haptic interaction, it cannot be reduced to the execution of one particular sexual act. Sensuality involves tenderness, caresses, embraces, kisses, gazes, and any other wishful, mnemonic, or imaginary aesthetic approach to another person. It is about actual sensations and about their future possibility. It vastly exceeds, therefore, the mechanics of penetration, an act that, although overrated in contemporary scholarship, is seldom mentioned in ancient literary sources, and for a very good reason. Except for medical texts, comedy, and otherwise chastising genres of discourse, the insertion of an intermittent organ in genital, anal, or oral orifices was irrelevant. Sensuality, on the contrary, captures the actual concerns of ancient thinkers and writers about Eros and Amor, which are very different from the scholarly improvisations of British, French, or North American classical scholars in the late 20th century of the Common Era. Far from opposing love and sex, Homeric characters, Sappho and her Greek and Roman successors, Plato and Ovid, understand the erotic, amorous life inseparably from a quest for the pleasure of all the senses and from a sorrowful phenomenology of its failure. The erotic body is a lived body. Love is its experience. Secondly, the amorous situation is essentially unstable, neither separable from the body nor a simple effect of its fabric and workings. Love is sensed, felt, and eagerly expected to be a pleasure, but it can turn to excruciating pain. Indeed, Eros is first and foremost the buoyant pursuit of a variety of enjoyable sensation. Love, we said, is sensuality, but because a sensual moment involves two desiring subjects, for one desires the other person's reciprocal desire, love is intrinsically uncertain and vulnerable to disappointment. Whenever courtship, gifts, and verbal persuasion fail to conjure up the beloved's response, a lover feels deeply hurt. Hence, their yearning, disillusionment, and lamentation. The ancients make all these connections. Sensual desire springs in the phenomenal body as an existential condition in which we lust after, long for, care for, and relish or sorely miss the presence, here and now, of another person whose mutual desire is all that matters. If only she came nearer and took my soft hand. Eros, like Pothos or Himeros, is all about the beloved's being there, visibly, tangibly, physically, and eagerly. It is all about wishing that she might be in love with us. The object of desire is a hyper-personified, elusive, mobile subject. Thirdly, love is the inexhaustible subject matter of thinking and speaking. In Greek Melic poetry or Roman elegy, the beloved inspires perceptual and vocal admiration, but the lover herself or himself voices what they are feeling, whereas medical writers scantily detail the tickling of arousal, the commotion of intertwined limbs, and the discharge of fluids in intercourse. Philosophers, novelists, and poets linger precisely on how embodied beings experience and express Eros and Amor. These are not romantic in the sense of idealized, dematerialized sentiments, quite the opposite. Whenever ancient writers try to communicate what being in love may entail for one of us, mortal humans, they use a language which, without being necessarily sexual, is nonetheless sensual. Physical metaphors convey what we might be tempted to call the emotional or psychological aspect of enamoredness. As we shall see in a moment, a lover feels chills and burns and thirst and waves and wounds and sparks. The discursive representation of love relies entirely on this metaphorical phenomenology. It is as if any attempt to put into words the existential condition of being in love, hopes, projects, regrets, frustrations, could only be articulated in such a concrete, materialistic, hyper-realistic language. The most poetic poets seem to be unable to disembody the erotic. The less pornographic novelists seem reluctant to direct their attention away from hues and textures and flavors. On the contrary, they see the entire gamut of erotic feelings through an aesthetic and even synesthetic lens, especially when coition is not taking place. A sentiment is a sensation, a state of mind is a state of the body, no mystical transcendence. If there is an experience that calls for a focus on materiality and the sentence, this is love. In love, we feel, think, imagine, remember, and speak while being aware that all our sensations, feelings, thoughts, and words always emerge from our shared embodiment. Love is inconceivable without the consciousness of our own lived body. I want to bring to the fore the corporeality, existential as well as metaphorical, which defines love in Greece and Rome. And I want to highlight the persistence and even the repetitiousness of a cultural history of ideas across time and idioms, while also emphasizing its ironic twist. The farther from the genitalia discourses carry their audience's imagination, the more creatively they extend the central physicality of the erotic. This is the only physiology of love that makes sense in ancient erotic culture. It is by doing justice to their erotic materialism, to their lived understanding of physis, that we can comprehend their true concerns. Physiology, therefore, must be understood as phenomenology. But this is not the application of a modern theory to ancient texts. It is rather an anthropological approach from the internal perspective of these ancient societies. It is they that deemed worthy of query the felt, sense, lived body. These cultural facts emerge clearly from a close reading of Greek and Roman discourses, including Plato's dialogues. They constantly bring the body to bear on a phenomenology of the erotic. Now, to conclude this moment of reflection, let me say that we are indeed ready for a change of paradigm. Forget sexuality. The very existence of divinities such as Aphrodite and Venus, Eros, Amor, and Cupido is the most striking manifestation of sensorial corporeality. A god is an idea, but this idea is personified. Anthropomorphic deities are thereby endowed with qualities and bestowed with powers. They are enmattered, embodied, and enfleshed like us. They also have a life. In the logic of polytheism, their specific impact on all living beings is already inscribed in their own physical fabric. When love is love, capital L, when Eros is Eros, capital Epsilon, Amor is Amor, Cupido is Cupido, it is this God's body that not only displays, but also enacts his supernatural powers. We have started from early Greek poetry. Let us now go backward from Rome, once again to take stock of the consistency of this transcultural history. Propertius invites his readers to appreciate Amor's corporeal features, his very young age, his distinctive equipment, his peculiar motricity, his typical gestures. Love is a miniature deity. A panoply of objects, namely a bow, arrows, and torches, complete his material identity. Just look at him. You will understand who he is, you will guess what he can do, and you will be able to fathom how we will make you feel. Handout number 5A. By indefinitely echoing this portrayal, Elegy deploys a phenomenology of love. It occasionally lingers on moments of sensuality for a poetic ego absorbed in the synesthetic contemplation of the beloved's presence. But most of the time, this metrically limping poetry voices the misery, the discontent, the recrimination, and above all, the inevitable failure of any relationship. It does so in a reiterated speech act, complaining. The querulous voice of the elegist lingers on concrete details and, more importantly, on impressions, feelings, symptoms felt in the flesh and to the bone. Seduction is difficult. A boy's heart often changes thanks to a word, whereas a girl will hardly mollify, even if you bleed. Once one has a mistress, displeasure is in order. Propertius warns a fellow artist, Ponticus, about the passion he's beginning to feel for a mistress, handout number 5B. This is merely the first spark, favilla, of a blazing flame, an evil still to come. Ponticus should approach the Tigresses of Armenia and bear the chains of Ixion's wheel rather than feel the child's bow in his very marrow again and again. Amor's hands reaches to the bones. Manus attigit ossa. As far as the poet in love is concerned, now that Cynthia has taken hold of him with her glances, well, love crushes his head, trampling it under feet. Love incessantly hovers above the head. He hovers above the lovers and sits heavy, even on free necks. Instat semper amor supra caput, instat amantit et gravis ipsa super libera colla sedet. There is no remedy except fleeing, which is anyway hopeless. Like Propertius' dismal lover, the stylish shepherds of another Augustan poet deplore the boy's cruelty. In the Eclogues, a pastoral singer laments, "Now I know what love is. Nunc scio quid sit amor." He is a small person, a poor and a naughty one. He is sevus, crudelis, improbus. Above all, he is hard, durus, and his hardness derives from the mountains that have given birth to him. So Virgil goes on, Amor has inherited their unyielding toughness. In response and in a sweeping reclamation of the erotic life as a good and agreeable life, of it will thank all the attributes of the gods, thus creating for him a diametrically opposite identity, precisely on account of his age, which is tender, etas mollis, this poor is malleable, yielding and teachable. Because young age is soft, it is also apt to be ruled, apta regi. An art of love, a manner of mastering the youth becomes possible and above all, highly successful. Pain, including rejection, jealousy, and any other wound, can be treated, handled, and converted into pleasure. Now, contradicting Ovid, thus echoing the dissuasive discourse of Elegy, a Stoic philosopher and a tragic poet, Seneca will resolutely refresh the blame of love, handout number 6. This boy, here named Desire, Cupido, has inherited physical qualities from his mother. He is now out of control. Desire belongs to Venus's lineage. She was born from the sea, which is a solid mass of liquid stuff perceived as uncharitable, non-metis. In turn, she has engendered this little rascal, now unbridled impotence in his abusive handling of arrows and torches. Both the water and the boy are inflexible. Like Virgil, Seneca emphasizes the transmission of material and maternal qualities. Like the elegist, the Stoic playwright draws attention to the excruciating pain Cupido causes in the lover's body. Fire in the heart, stabs penetrating deeply into the marrow. And let me add that there is indeed a Stoic sensuality, for the normative imperative to cultivate a friendly kind of Eros still relies on beauty. According to Diogenes Laertius, the Stoics said love is an effort toward friendliness due to or because of visible beauty appearing. It's wonderful. Eina de ton aerota epibolen philopoias, dia kalos em phenomenon. Its sole end being friendship, not intercourse. Eros is philia, as Chrysippus says in his treatise on love, and is not sent by the god, and beauty they describe as the bloom or flower of virtue. So beauty, anyway. Amor's ekphrastic portrayals convey a theology as well as a phenomenology of the erotic experience. With Ovid's exception, such an experience is disastrous, somber, sometimes even macabre. A whining lover describes his existential unhappiness in hyper-realistic, again, anatomical, physiological, pathological terms. A longing for pleasure has become an addiction to pain, and the pain seems to be inconceivable except as physical discomfort. It is as if poetry could not find the words to articulate a psychological or emotional language of love. Pain is corporeal. Now, piercing arrows and burning torches are objects that metaphorize a state of mind, but this is not a reason for downplaying their materiality. On the contrary, we should fully appreciate the pointed materialism of these sensorial metaphors. These poets are only able to describe what they feel, amorous agony, disappointment, longing, in corporeal terms. It is bodily sensations, again, waves, winds, wounds, burns, chills, stings, that create a lived experience. Once again, there is no language for a psychological, emotional grief. There are twinges and scalds or chronic pain. To love is to leave one's own body. This is a cultural fact. Amor is a powerful God indeed, which means that he is able to have an effect on us because he is embodied in a certain flesh, shaped in a human form, trapped in a given age, endowed with a swift, albeit capricious mobility. It is Amor's physical singularity that predisposes him to behave as he does, senselessly, weightlessly, restlessly. It is thanks to his idiosyncratic corporeality that, like any other god, Amor can live his own life and interfere with ours. Even his moral quality, be they cruelty, wildness, or docility, have to do with his being first and foremost a naughty, playful, threatening, small boy. For better or worse, his character goes with his age. Ultimately, it is love's own embodied manners that act upon a lover which runs contrary to any dematerializing or depersonalizing, thus deeply misguided view of ancient polytheism. Two considerations emerge from these poetic discourses. Divinity can only be powers because they are enfleshed, active, and alive. Power is not the unidirectional, predictable domination of one partner upon the other in the amorous interaction, but a shared experience of yielding to love himself. But there is more to say about the logic of the concrete running through the Roman discourse on love. The very cause of the pain lies in the primary qualities that are found in love's own body, namely its size, shape, motion, and solidity. The god himself is minute, anthropomorphic, winged, hard, or soft, but neither matter nor form are enough to define a god. A god, we have said, has a life. He makes his somatic properties into habits, inclinations, and manners. He lives his own body. Now, Eros' behavior can be inconsistent because, as Propertius laments, notwithstanding his wings, his arrows settle, manent in the poet's bloodless veins. If only this tiny foe could fly away from the lover's breast, if only he were to shoot his missiles elsewhere. Since he seems unable to fly away and leave the poet alone, surely he has lost his wings. The irony of such a reconfiguration of Amor reveals the ingenuity of a discourse that keeps selecting and combining, recombining the same body parts, but takes the reader by surprise. The god is winged, the god is immovable, the god is incongruous. The incongruity itself must be explained, but it can only be explained in anatomical terms. He does have wings, but he must have lost them. The obvious is not obvious at all. Now, Roman writers reconfigure Greek depictions of Eros. More complicated than that, of course. In both cultures, a theory of love emerges from an ekphrastic discourse in which iconography meets theology, semiotics meets physiology. Eros is both an experience and a god. Both call for an interpretation. Why? Well, because at face value, Eros's body says it all, and yet the message is not self-evident. Let us take stock of this aesthetically fastidious and yet elusive language. Focus, again, the arrows and the wings. Meleager of Gadara says, is it any wonder if love, the bane of mankind, shoots arrows that breathe fire and laughs bitterly with cruel eyes? Isn't it his mother Ares, beloved, and Hephaestus' wife, partaking of both fire and swords? In the novel Ethiopica by Heliodorus, the male protagonist Theagenes boasts about his own speed in amorous circumstances. You know that painters made love winged, signifying thereby how rapid are the motions of his captives. A straightforward materialistic allegory is incorporated in the figure of this armed, flying, laughing child. All clear. By looking at him, you know already what you can expect. And yet, you can be surprised. It takes a comic poet such as Eubulus to ask, what was the first human being who painted or modeled in wax Eros equipped with wings? Before mocking the sheer absurdity of such a depiction, Eros is heavy, and we are dealing now in Greek with the twists and turns of incongruence. Now, Daphnis and Chloe is a pastoral novel, as we know, attributed to Longos. It is the convoluted story of two foundlings in a world of shepherds. The adoptive parents of the adolescents have a dream. Sun nymphs introduce the two youngsters to a handsome boy who has wings upon his shoulders and a little bow and arrows in his hands. The vision of this creature does not ring a bell. They have not the slightest idea of who he might be. Like them, Chloe and Daphnis ignore the very existence of someone named Eros. It is only a grown-up gardener, Philetas, who tries to teach them who this mysterious being is. He is a god. He has a name, Eros. Philetas also adds a profusely detailed depiction of the boy. He is naked, as pale as milk, as blonde as fire, gleaming as if just bathed. His laughter and his voice are such that no swallow, no nightingale, no swan can compete. He is swifter than a hawk or an eagle, thus impossible to catch. He looks like a boy, but he is not young, for he is more ancient than Kronos himself. He is indeed equipped with wings on his shoulder and a little bow and arrows between his wings. Handout number 7. Although instructed, Daphnis and Chloe still wonder, is this a boy or is this a bird? And what can he possibly do? Their advisor replies, Eros is a god, young, beautiful, and winged. This is why he enjoys youth, pursues beauty, and makes grow wings in the soul. As far as power is concerned, he is mightier than Zeus, for he rules Crate, the entire world, from the elements to the stars, to the other gods. All the flowers are the work of love, all the trees are his creation, and on his account, rivers flow and winds blow. To experience his power is to suffer the inability to eat or drink, to endure sleepless nights, to feel pain in the soul, to have the heart throbbing, to freeze, to scream as if one were, were beaten, to rest like a corpse, to plunge into rivers as if on fire. No, there is no remedy for love, none to drink, to eat, or chant in songs, except kissing, embracing, and lying down together with naked body. This lesson sounds clear, and yet Chloe and Daphnis will take a very long time to learn it, especially the conclusion. This depiction of Eros is intricately elusive. Being self-young, beautiful, and winged, Eros makes you pursue beauty and youth while transforming you to his image and likeness, since he gives wings to your soul, as it happens to the beloved, flush with the stream of a lover's desire in Plato's Phaedrus. On Eros' age and merits, Philetas echoes Agathon in Plato's Symposium. On the erotic responsiveness of nature, the gardener is attuned to the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite and to Lucretius' celebration of Venus at the beginning of the Rerum Natura. On the sickness of love, incurable except by yielding to the very force of desire, Philetas seems to allude to Euripides' Hippolytus and Seneca's Phaedra, but in the novel, the erotodidactic irony conjures up an Ovidian mood. Gratification is indeed a remedy, the only one. This is a slow-paced success story, not a tragedy. But the narration itself creates a paradox. According to Philetas, this little body says it all in a vivid, eloquent allegory of the god's own powers, and yet this same body must be deciphered, and it takes an expert, a preceptor of love, precisely to do so. The anatomy and physiology of Eros, therefore, present the characters and the readers of the novel with a hermeneutical challenge. The god's looks are a puzzle rather than an epiphany. In its intrinsic irony, Philetas' tableau harks back to a poem by Bion of Smyrna, a bucolic poet flourished in the 3rd century BCE. Sorry for this occasional glosses. Handout number 8. I let you perhaps read, as in Longo's novel, a proper reading of the allegorical features of Eros requires a special expertise, and once understood, the god's appearance conveys a non-obvious message. The bird flees from you, but it is you who should flee it. For now, his wings are taking him away from you. Later, the same feathers will bring him back and actually fix him on your very head. An elusive prey will become an infallible hunter, while you, who once hoped to catch the bird, will then find his presence unsufferable. Eros makes you desire and systematically trumps your desire. Eros is bad, he's kakon, Bion repeats in another poem. Aphrodite, his mother, made him savage, unloving, such as the shape is dissimilar from the mind. The shape is dissimilar from the mind. Agrion, Astragon, Morphanon, Uden, Homoion. She made him winged and far-shooting so that we are unable to avoid him, although he is so bitter and piercing. Roman elegiac poets and Lucretians will amplify precisely this badness, thus teaching a negative art of love, that of avoiding it. The enigmatic appearance of the gods, so small yet so powerful, so cute yet so cruel, finds its culmination in a poem attributed to Moschus, The Runaway Love, handout number 9. How can we recognize Eros? Again, this is an open question. His own mother, Aphrodite, sketches an identikit. The god's appearance again belies his character. All his tiny, thus seemingly innocuous features produce huge effect. His nudity goes with deceptiveness. His mobility results in a fixation, precisely when you would want for him to fly away. Like Propertius, as we have seen, but also like Greek writers such as Meleager and Philostratus, Moschus plays with the gods' annoying use of the wings. Aphrodite herself teaches you, reader, how to avoid Eros. She herself has been a victim of his powers. She reveals that his sweet words are at odds with the wickedness of his thoughts. The god's body is a mixture of evidence and deception. This brief aperçu shows the points of focalization of the Greek and Roman discourses on the erotic. When we look at the god, we can see an emphasis on solidity and its variations, hardness, softness, fluidity. On size, Eros and Amor are small. On shape, this is a miniature warrior, a tiny player, and in any case, an anthropomorphic god. On motion, he is able to fly. These are intrinsic physical qualities, but they are intertwined with attitudes and propensions, with agency and subjectivity. Stoniness is lived as cruelty. The weapons are put to work to cause agony. The wings help the god come close and move away, thus causing abandon and betrayal. Love is a body, but a lived and lively body. Hence the profusion of adjectives that detail his way of life, from harsh to mirthful, from teachable to hostile. Furthermore, to enrich a nuanced semantic field, love is incongruous, bitter and sweet, cold and hot, super powerful and undersized, babyish and formidable, brilliant and dark, an unyielding fighter, a malleable liquid. Love is a living oxymoron, capable of conflicting effects. For if love himself is a body, love, small case, is embodiment, pleasant sensuality, hopeful desire, desire that the beloved will be there, present, tangible, and affectionate, excruciating wounds deep down in the marrow. Beyond the metaphorization of an emotional pain, the suffering is felt in the flesh. Love imbues, attacks, pierces, chills, burns, or deserts. Let us indulge in one last aesthetic moment. Eros is glittering, is stillborn. Aphrodite is much golden in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, bejeweled with earrings, brooches, necklaces, and embroidered tunics. She looks as incandescent as fire, as glowing as the moon. Aphrodite emits streams of light for Anchises' immediate enchantment. Likewise, beautiful people are radiant. The light of love shines on his purpureal cheeks. Phos erotos, as Phrynichus said about another Trojan prince, Troilus. But in the Trojan women, Hecuba reminds Helen of her reaction to Paris. The young man was exceptionally distinguished in beauties. She says, as soon as Helen caught sight of him in gorgeous foreign cloth, ablaze with gold, lamprone, she fell madly in love. Every reader or listener of the Iliad knows that Paris looked especially attractive to Helen while laying in bed, dazzling in his beauty and his garments. Calleite stillborn, kai amazing. It is Aphrodite who describes him in these enticing words, and her own beauty springs out of her disguise as an old woman, the super beautiful neck, the desirable breast, and the flashing eye emerge out of the ugly aged carcass in rags. Like Helen, we too cannot help being visually inundated with all this light. To gleam, stillborn, is also what Odysseus does on the Phaeacian beach, covered in olive oil and metaphorical metallized. He is dazzling with beauty and grace. Kalle kai kairisi, stillborn. And the girl stares at him. The older man shines, a young woman, Nausicaa, cannot take her eyes off him, just like Penelope when the same man comes home. Much later in Chariton's novel, Chaereas and Callirrhoe, a young man comes out of the gymnasium coruscating like a star, stillborn Ospera stare. In his love letters, Philostratus is at a loss as to which of many details of a young woman to praise: the head, the cheeks, the lips, the hands, the breast, the belly. If she were to show what is hidden beneath her garments, he believes that he would be struck by lightning. This flamboyant aesthetic that associates beauty not with static features, but with a glaring, arresting, provoking luminosity is the true deep resource of Plato's Eros. Beautiful bodies, takalasomata, have the power to cause desire. Their beauty will not leave you alone. Diotima insists on the sensory immersion precisely. Here is a beauty filled with human flesh and colors and with mortal frivolity in abundance. She emphasizing the lover's desire to feast their eyes on those youth, orontes tataidika, and to stay all the time in their company. Hence the imperative, she says, the imperative for a young man to walk towards the bodies that are beautiful. Deigar, yenai epi takalasometes. Chromatically vivid, those somata cause the event of desire. And as Diotima cheerfully explains to Socrates, this is the right start. This is the way to go. Movement and light. Love is cinema. Love is sensuality. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Ben, are you taking over?
Yes, I'll take over now to manage the questions. Thank you, Giulia, for a sort of a tsunami of thought provocation to use another nautical metaphor. I feel overwhelmed by the ideas, and I think your paper would repay long reconsideration to do it justice. But there was a wonderful presentation and such incredibly rich material that you've provided for us to work with. So what we might do is now turn to questions, and we'll adopt our usual approach to the questions, which is if anyone would like to ask a question, they can type the letter Q into the chat, and by typing the letter Q, you enter the queue. Sorry for the pun, or else you could type the question out in the chat, and I will read it for you if you don't wish to read it out. So we might just leave this wonderful image on the screen while question time takes place, and in keeping also with our usual practice, it's Bob Cowan who has the first question. Bob, fire away.
Thanks, Brendan, and thanks so much, Giulia. And apologies both retrospectively and in advance. I had to leave for 15 minutes for a student who never actually showed up. So if you may have answered my question in the course of that crucial quarter hour, and apologies if so. Wonderful, wonderful paper. As Ben said, I just wanted, I mean,
I didn't
totally
sabotage your appointment.
Thank you. And you, I mean, so convincingly sort of separated sort of sensuality from sexuality, and particularly from penetration. I wondered how sort of elements of marriage and of procreation come into this. I mean, obviously as the telos of the ancient novel, and of course the playful sensuality of Daphnis and Chloe will, well, if we believe Jack Winkler, end in a slightly darker sort of a damping down of Chloe's exuberance for the hidden injuries of sex. And I'm just wondering whether this emphasis on the sensual over the sexual, and the sexual leading, of course, to the due production of offspring, is I mean, is it a countercultural response to the way that sexual relations ought to be conducted? Is this is an alternative, or is it an enriching? Is it like Penelope, like Chloe, that sensuality can pervade marriage and complement procreation as opposed to being an alternative?
Thank you very much for the question. I would like to reply in a cinematographic manner. Not just because, you know, one could say that Eros is the kinema of the soul, but because if we read, for instance, the Odyssey, the conjugal moment, the return home, let's read it as if we were talking about a movie. What is it that the director wanted to frame? Where is the focus? Where is the focalization? Where is the time spent in order to say this and then perhaps that? So if we watch the movie, the Homeric movie of the Odyssey, well, the focus, the attention, the way the language catches the detail is precisely in those moments of kissing, embracing, looking at, you know, the fact that Odysseus has been embellished exactly in the same way by Athena as he was embellished when he arrived in front of Nausicaa. So if you look what the Homeric camera does, what matters for the poem in the meantime is precisely all this sensorial experience. It's out there, it's in the text. Now, of course, you know, we could say, what kind of movie is this? Soft porn? I don't know, you tell me. I mean, no one explains what happens in the sexual organs of the suitors, but we know that their knees go soft. And so, this, you know, is exactly what I would like simply to highlight the cinematographic technique of this poetry. What is it that matters? What is it that matters? And, you know, all archaic poetry is about that. So, of course, you have a normative discourse on procreation. Of course, if you read Hippocrates, you have a description of what happens precisely in heterosexual intercourse. Of course, if you read the Problemata attributed to Aristotle, you have all sort of precisely of accounts and descriptions of the sort of the plumbing of the body. But then you are in that kind of discourses that have their own research project and epistemic ambition. But, you know, the real the real flux of words about Eros, the experience and the God, Amor, the experience and the God, really pays attention to that pleasure, because, and that desire, and that experience of that pleasurable desire or its failure. So yes, of course, procreation is there. Yet, of course, yes, of course, there is the, it works, okay? There is, you know, when gods seduce young women, as Poseidon would say, it's rarely without pregnancy. Of course, of course, of course. At the same time, where does the camera go? And, you know, elegy is all about that. As a selfie, you know, in a sense, the constant selfie. So yes.
Okay, we turn now to a question from Charles.
Hi, Giulia. It's great to see you.
So wonderful to see you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for a really incredible paper, a real whirlwind tour. And this is not to do injustice to all the evidence, but I wanted to ask you more about your title. Because I think it's really only because it's really brilliant. You know, I assume it's a reference to Baudrillard's Forget Foucault.
Well,
if I'm mistaken or not.
To point it, but
right.
it's absolute. You're right. Okay, I tried to turn around, but you are.
But with that, I think it's an important point, only because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the criticism of the interpretation of what is ancient sexuality is this reduction to power relations, right?
It's exhausting.
And so I guess the question for me, and maybe you could speak more about this, is it Foucault's analysis of sexuality that's the problem, or is it the application of Foucault that's the problem? And I have a slight follow-up, which is related to sort of the problem of the subject, I guess, is, you know, because for Foucault, there's this issue of power as it pertains to the subject. And I think everything that you're saying is really speaking to this whole issue of, you know, of the problem of the subject, and if we should be reconceptualizing it.
Yes. When I said it's exhausting, it's the whole cumbersome positioning on pre-modern, modern, how to read the history of sexuality. And, you know, I have a lot to say. I did it already, and it's only getting worse because the more I work, the more I realize how wrong the whole thing is. So let me be direct, kindly, and collegially for all those who are very much into that paradigm and find all sort of, you know, correctives for the anomalies. I think we have to get out of it, but really because it's wrong, and it's wrong because the question of the subject of desire, the question of what is an object of desire. I've written a very long paper on the notion of intentional object to counteract the language of objectification. So the question of the subject of desire, the question of the object of desire, the question of the dialectic of desire, the question of desire being desire of desire, all this which is just there, because when we read those poems, this is what matters. This is where the poetic camera goes. This is where the metaphors goes. This is what is recounted is about. So power. Well, I know that, you know, you are the author of The Moment on Power, and I can't wait to somehow talk to you again about these things. I don't know exactly what you think, Charlie, but you know, power. If we let's not talk about Foucault for a moment, but let's talk about the real pertinence of a language of power in this erotic situation. I like very much more and more, I like to talk about situations, okay? In the erotic situation, power is the power of Eros. It begins with Hesiod. One is overwhelmed by Eros. That is exactly the problem. And the softening is part of the experience of precisely losing your means. So this theme of the Lusimeles, there are other texts, this hopefully will become a written paper. It's a real discourse. There is a real language, you know. I'm attentive to the erotic culture understood as languages, in other words, keywords, key questions that circulate, that create focalizations and relevance. This is what is relevant. What is relevant is the power of love on you, is the fact that desire takes you, that you are disabled by desire. So, I mean, this goes on and on and on. It goes through tragedy, it goes through philosophy. I didn't really linger on the Platonic part because it would have been too long. But, you know, I have a reading of the Symposium, which is exactly following this line of the embodiment of the concrete, etc. So this is the problematic of power in the erotic context. And when there is power in a couple, in a dynamic of two lovers, that power most of the time is reversible. Even the metaphor of slavery is reversible. So, you know, everything has to be rethought. The texts have to be reread. And this is happening because even Nick Fisher now has a wonderful paper completely demolishing the orthodox reading of the Symposium by Xenophon on the difference between Eros and Philia and so on and so forth. So we are many people working away, trying to say, hey, hello, the pederastic model doesn't work. It's not so simple, it's not so schematic, active, passive, please. Let's look at real activity, real so-called passivity in our discourses. We are many, but you know, you have still the model, the paradigm, it works like this. It just doesn't work. It's just wrong. It's just broken. And, you know, I'm ready to talk, to look at text with anyone who would like to, you know, provoke me, counter-provoke me, bring it on. Bring it on because really it doesn't work. So power, it's absolutely important, but even if we read Foucault properly, if we really want to go there, I'm writing a piece in this moment of the Kinaidos, and even so I revisit those aspects from that point of view too. Well, if we read properly Foucault, the famous isomorphism in the use of pleasure between mastery of yourself, social dynamics of domination and penetration. The more you read, the more it falls apart. I cannot really explain this now because it would be too long, but you know, even Foucault says that you cannot reduce active passive, you cannot reduce the dynamic of precisely erotic interaction to active versus passive. Even Foucault tells you that you should not overinterpret the fact that sexuality is a word invented at the end of the 19th century. What he says in volume 1. There is an abyss between volume 1 and the 2 volumes on sexuality. So, you know, there is an enormous unpacking to do, which I've been doing, which I'm doing. So yes, yes, forget sexuality, forget the whole tired, exhausting question about the word and before and after. Yes, let's forget about it. Let's go and read. Really, let's go and read. And now there are more and more wonderful translations on top of that. So we don't even have to, to do an immense philological work, because there are wonderful philologists who help us do the work. And I don't even talk about tragedy. You know, I think that in short, all this penetration model has been the generalization of a very precise way of thinking, speaking about sexuality, which is comedy. So it's a comic illusion. It is a comic illusion. The pederastic model is a comic illusion that you find in certain kind of public rhetoric too, because you have that kind of public, that kind of audience. It's about blame. I think that we have to rethink everything from, among other, you know, important standpoint, the opposition between praise and blame. When you blame, and this is something that, you know, I had already started to think in these terms with sex and sensuality, and then I've continued it. If you blame, yes, you have active and passive. If you blame, yes, you have this sort of disjunction between the two partners. And if you blame, you're obsessed with penetration and with its violence and what happens on the receiving side. It is a comic illusion. But if you praise, well, it's exactly the opposite. It's all about complicity, connivance, exchange of roles, reciprocity, and softness. This is why Agathon is the great theorist, you know, of the praise of love. And this is why, you know, I had found very interesting to compare the Agathon of Aristophanes and the Agathon of Plato, because you see exactly precisely what happens to the same character if you put it in on the mécané of the comic stage for the kind of people who are supposed to laugh, like the in-law on stage. And if you take the same poet and you put it in the Platonic world at home, so to speak, as he is in the symposium, completely different treatment. Very, very interesting. I think that praise blame is really something that orients what is said about the relationship of power, and therefore, you know, that too is not, you know,
Yeah.
it's not something of the last minute, but
Well, thank you, Giulia. I mean, I'm
too much. No, it's too much because you made me do what I didn't want to do.
No, but but I think it's really important, and you know, you sort of,
I know.
I think you hit the nail on the head too with the emphasis on Eros. Even if we wanted to frame this in terms of power, it's Eros who is the agentive subject.
This is what I'm saying, is
And
that, you
most
know,
of people's reading is a secularization, as though the gods weren't existing within the minds of the ancient Greeks. And you know, I'll share my notes, but the language of domination, the act of killing, with the damazo verb that's also Eros as a subject there, it's really sort of parallels very well, because, you know, in Homer at least, it's almost always the god who is the subject of the verb damazo, and humans are pupa, right? The agent plus hupo plus the genitive. They're instruments rather than subjective agents. And so I think
There you are. This is the work that has to be done. This is the real work that has to be done. I'm going to say something. Foucault speaks about power and domination all over the place. Where is the definition of power? You know that power is small, that you have a microphysics of powers, that is not sovereignty, that it's all over the place, that it's also positive. But what is it? Is there a dynamic definition? I mean, American social sciences have a dynamic definition of power as the ability to make people do something. Well, that makes you think, but with Foucault, power is everywhere, and ask Foucauldian to define power. They always say, oh, there is this and there is that, What would Socrates say at this kind of definition? So you're absolutely right. And, it's not, Foucault was a great man, but, we know how he got to work on antiquity. He got to work on antiquity asking for, fish from Paul Venn and Jean-Pierre Vernon, basically. And, constructing even his world and his object in a way that, is embarrassing. We know that. It's not by saying, oh, he's a great man, but I'm going to scratch the little pimple and say what's missing. Well, if you write a book called The History of Sexuality in Antiquity and you have zero tragedy, yeah, I'm sorry. This is a problem. Where are all these poets who talk about Eros and loving, all the feminine part? Because also the androcentric logic of this discourse about penetration, I find it more and more unbearable. It's terribly androcentric. It's terribly androcentric. And precisely with the excuse that, oh, there is no effemination. So there is an incredible refoulement, really, of everything that is precisely of the order of the soft. Because these people don't want to see the soft. Because then you have to deal with precisely this queer, let's say. I mean, my reading of this material is, queer. Sensuality is queer because you have a real, I don't like the metaphor of fluidity, but a real redistribution of qualities, of physical qualities, where the feminine is not, as always, down there, in a corner, but perhaps is the paradigm. And that too changes completely the situation. Because Penelope has, the experience of feeling her knees loosen exactly like the suitors. Why is this important? And this is sexual, it's erotic. There are people who say, oh, Penelope, she is important only because she is the wife of Odysseus, blah, blah, blah. The other, great, a great source of banality. No, they want to be in bed with her. But the text, the camera goes to the knees, doesn't go to another part of the body, goes to the knees, and the knees are melting. So this is Greek. This is Greek. This is not French. This is not Californian. This is not other places in the world. This is Greek. And I think that there is so much to discover and rediscover. I mean, I admire enormously, even if I don't agree completely on the overwhelming performative perspective, but Claude Calam's work. You read Claude and you see what's going on in Greek culture. Now, even Claude takes all sorts of precautions, what we call sexuality, how we position ourselves. I have a wonderful working relationship with Claude talking about these things. And, you know, the more you read Claude, the more you read the text, the more you look at these things, and the more, you know, penetration really becomes an Aristophanes thing or a comic thing, that crudeness, that violence, and that polarization. And it doesn't even work there, because precisely, you know, I am preparing a little thing on queer sensuality. Even in the Thesmophoria Tsusai, when you have the in-law, which covered of, you know, here's a caricature of the Athenian male, covered in hair, wants to sodomize everything that moves. And on the other hand, you have Agathon. But, you know, at some point, the in-law says, by listening to this voice and this music, I feel a very strange tickling in my anus. So not even on the comic stage, where there is this caricature precisely of the super macho, super, you know, hairy, super aggressive on the one hand, and the hyper feminine goodness on the other. Not even there, the dichotomy resists. It's just a mistake. I'm sorry.
I am lost. I'm sorry. I'm lost to take to jump into the gap there. And I certainly do not want to stop you from talking, Giulia, because it's fascinating.
No. You should. And I should do it myself, by the way.
There are a few more questions, and I hope you don't mind if we kind of.
Oh yes, it's that I don't see any hands, so this is why I was abusing the courtesy. So sorry.
Oh no, that's okay. Emily, you have a question?
Absolutely, and thank you for the talk and for the Q&A. I don't think that was an abuse of the question time. I think that was a great use of the question time. My question will turn us, I think, from some of these sort of bigger questions to something a little bit more local, which, to the degree that I found all of this really helpful, but to any degree that was for you something that's like an exhausting part of this, maybe this will be a fun turn, sort of more to the texts. What I was really interested in was what you described as the pointed materialism of these depictions of eroticism. And the angle I was coming at this from, and so I just wanted to invite you to talk more about, was I was thinking about that text from Seneca, and then I was thinking about sort of the literal Stoic materialism that lies behind, you know, the thought that emotions are physical states of the brain, so there's kind of no other option to describe them. And then I just started thinking a little bit more broadly in Greek philosophy, this tradition of making love a physical force, going back to Empedocles with love and strife as these physical forces. So yeah, I just wanted to invite you to say more about pointed materialism, Greek philosophy, and erotics. I just thought that was really fascinating to bring out.
Thank you very much. I think that one of the reasons I think this move from sexuality to sensuality is, or maybe, I hope, timely and part of the current language in our scholarship is precisely because materialism has gained so much traction, and that there is a real taking seriously of precisely things and objects and hyper-objects and all the new creativity that is, you know, just flourishing at the moment, especially among younger scholars. So I think it's a very good time. It's a very good time. And the erotic, you know, stands just there in the middle. So you're absolutely right. And of course, there is an enormous work to do in connecting precisely the poetic discourse and its focalizations on the one hand, and the really physiological, in all sorts of meanings of the words, domains of knowledge. This is precisely the best Foucault, the Foucault who says domains of knowledge are always extremely important. Let me say something here, profoundly respectful vis-a-vis Foucault, definition of sexuality, introduction of the use of pleasure, completely different from what he says about sexuality in volume 1, that belongs to a completely different idea of 5 volumes entirely on the present. Change is not just the topic from modern to ancient, changes the definition of sexuality. Definition of sexuality, an experience at the crossroad of domains of knowledge, forms of normativity, forms of subjectivation in a culture. So forget all the before sexuality, after sexuality, the Council of Trent, the 19th century, forgotten. For Foucault, there is sexuality in antiquity. Oh, yes, because in any society, give me a society in which you don't have the combination of domains of knowledge, forms of normativity, and forms of subjectivity. Now, this is the good Foucault. And this is the work that I should do, and I think we should do. Really go and look in a very fine and subtle way how metaphors that have to do with solidity, with fluidity, connect or do not connect with medical discourses and all the Aristotelian corpus, all the problemata, and Empedocles is certainly there. So all this physicality. And of course, the huge presence here, Lucretius, because we don't understand, I think, the Elegist without Lucretius. We don't understand Ovid without Lucretius. I think that Ovid really has a project of constantly thinking and writing against with Lucretius, and reverses completely the perspective, but always with Lucretius there. So I think that materialism should be brought together as a domain of knowledge with the discourse of poetry and with the forms of normativity. And about the Stoics, this is my sort of next step in order to try to look more precise at the question of beauty, because beauty, we all know about beauty, we read wonderful books about beauty, etc. But really the physicality of beauty, the light, beauty is something that irradiates. This is why it's so important. Now you have Jane Bennett and all these sort of animist contemporary philosophers or anthropologists who want us to think in these terms. Objects do something to us. Well, but let's look at the vocabulary of light in antiquity and of what is beauty. Beauty is something that grabs you, that disturbs you, that arouses you, that causes eros. Also, all the theories of vision. I mean, there is so much to do, and there are so many people who more and more work precisely on this theories of the bodies and theories of perception. I mean, Jane Porter or Douglas Cairns. I mean, they come to mind, but there are many others certainly also in the room. So I think we are, in a sense, resuscitating a certain kind of Greek and ancient materialism that I think is part of the critical antiquities project, or could be part of the critical antiquities project. I mean, that kind of materialism, yes, I think is the way to go. And for the Stoics, I'm still not ready to reply to you, but yes.
Huge thank you. No, this was, there's so much more to say here. But yeah, of course, we'll go on to further questions. But yes, this is fascinating. Yeah.
I know, but you know, everything is, this famous passage of the Problemata on the flux of the semen that takes a different channel, and instead of going in a male body to the penis, goes to the anus, and then there is this humidity that remains there, and this makes these men as insatiable as women. This is what they thought. So, you know, to talk about passivity is just, it's really the wrong foot. You forgive me, a very low-key metaphor here, because the more passive you are, the more desiring you are. The more desiring you are, the more desiring to be desired you are. So it's absolute nonsense, nonsense. But there is a lot of wonderful, exciting work to do for people, you know, older, younger, and especially younger scholars, and you know, dissertations, and
I think we have one more question from Melina.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and wonderful Q&A. This is a really narrow question after the sort of amazing conversation this far, but I was really interested in the passages that you shared. So I loved everything you said about thinking with sensuality rather than sexuality, and sort of setting aside reproduction as a separate concern. But I was interested in these agricultural metaphors and metaphors of like flowers and springtime and like blossoming, and sort of whether they have both those, they carry both those sets of associations, right? The kind of sensuality of spring and also like the cycle of the generations, and how you see those sets of associations as interacting in like the Eros Gamos or something like that. Yeah, I don't know how you see those two uses.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question, because this is my, in the order of what I have to to explore really as ideas generated by this very text. That is the next one. Because this, the idea of the sensation brings us to have to think about aesthesis, about touching in particular, about flesh, about skin, about contact. And so in a sense about the lowest forms of perception, but lowest as long as we don't read, because if we read, for instance, Apuleius, we realize that there is no way out of touch. So touch is a form of, as Aristotelians know very well, actually it is a form of perception, which is a knowledge, which is extremely important. So the more we pay attention to sensoriality, the more we see also the human, non-human difference somehow fading. And the next stop are plants. Now, plants are extremely important because, first of all, they are there in this sort of aesthetic resonance, visual aesthetic resonance with what happens, both in the Homeric hymns to Aphrodite, for instance. A wonderful graduate student here with us, Colin Moat, I did a seminar on Eros, and he, you know, looked, because he's very interesting, precisely interested in eco-criticism, looked at what happens to the landscape of the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite from the point of view of all these sort of interactions and nuances. And suddenly the text, boom, you know, somehow blooms, so to speak, because it's easy to see what happens between humans and non-human animals. But if we look beyond, the plant world is erotically extremely important. The pastoral, the propitiousness of a certain kind of environment to sensuality. Perhaps the same qualities go from trees and flowers and fruit and grass to the human character. So there is an immense work to do, I think, in this sense. And let's remember that for Aristotle, a plant is a sort of couple, united, sort of welded and fused forever, having sex forever. So it's a pornographic vision of the vegetable world, which I find extremely interesting, because there is all this all important question of what is separation of bodies, why male and female are separated, how they get together, the question of motricity, all this sort of way of looking phenomenologically. Also because, phenomenologically, look at the vocabulary of the phenomenon, which is there. It's there. Beauty is a phenomenon. And, what we have been talking about is pure phenomenology, pure phenomenology. So I think there is a renaissance of Merleau-Ponty's studies, which is amazing in this moment, across the Atlantic. So we have a lot to do, and this plus the eco-critical sensibility of contemporary scholars gives a lot of energy, I think, and a lot of potential, very interesting thinking and understanding. What do you think?
Did you want to reply to that, Melina, or are you finished with that one?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Such a wonderful.
Just thinking about Merleau-Ponty and the renaissance of his thought, and also the philosophical ancestry, if you like, or genealogy of your revolt against the sexuality. Can I ask if Nietzsche has a place in here? By some strange fortune, I was reading over the weekend the Twilight of the Idols, where Nietzsche advocates a return to the sensual against a kind of a Christian excoriation of the body and so on. And in there, he has some remarkable turns of phrase which seem to echo things that you're saying about love and sensuality, and about how, in fact, what has been banished to the lower forms of experience should, in fact, be exalted to the highest. His discussion of the sense of smell as a kind of way of understanding the world is extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. Yes, we didn't talk about smell, but thank you for bringing it up, because precisely all the dimension of perfume and spices is obviously very important here. And thank you for your question, because I think that what is happening is truly exciting, because you have this rediscovery of Merleau-Ponty, including in feminist theory in France. Really, this is happening as we speak. Very, very, sort of works in progress or books that come out with this moving of the positioning from Simone de Beauvoir to Merleau-Ponty. Very, very interesting. But what is happening also is a potential rediscovery of Lévi-Strauss and structural analysis and the logic of the concrete. When I say the logic of the concrete, I should say that this is an expression that has a provenance, is pure Lévi-Strauss, Françoise Héritier parlance and language. and the logic of the concrete, which is the core, the reality, the sort of heuristic virtue of real structural analysis, not of structuralism. We don't know what it is. It's like the pederastic model. But there is structural analysis, and structural analysis is all about precisely plants and the famous expression, animals are good to think with. Well, plants too, and stars too, and minerals too. And, you know, what was this project of reading, including ancient literature and ancient mythology through this encoding in the famous idea that there are different layers of language in a myth, social, but also astronomical, but also botanical, but also zoological, and there is meaning. And this meaning is plotted diachronically, and we have to understand the logic. One can despise it, but that was the project. And therefore, it was all about these things, all about this concreteness, this phenomena, what is perceived, what is smelled. You know, Marcel Detien's the Gardens of Adonis is all about smell. And it's all about, you have a theory of marriage and of love precisely constructed upon the experience of the senses and the experience of smell. So what is happening is at the same time a rediscovery of phenomenology and a rediscovery of structural analysis. And then suddenly we realize how important was the relationship intellectually between Merleau-Ponty and Lévi-Strauss, in case we thought that phenomenology was something completely disconnected from what is called structuralism. So there are all sorts of ways of rethinking nature here. And I'm still, you know, like many of us, reading and mulling on Philippe Descola' own take on Lévi-Strauss in Beyond Nature and Culture. And I find the book by Descola with this 4 ontology, one of which is animism, incredibly inspiring, because, you know, you can read of its metamorphosis with this model of animism, and it works. It really works. So yes, all this, the sense of materiality, but a lived materiality, see? So the subjectivity incorporated in the phenomenon is there for someone. I think that one could argue that there is a subject for, you know, someone who is with Lévi-Strauss too, contrary to what might be argued for. But this is where even really the language, the way of speaking of someone like Merleau-Ponty gives you wings, so to speak. It's so yes, everything is coming together very nicely in a super, you know, creative way, because you could say that structural analysis is a prehistory of eco-criticism.
Well, that is very interesting, and of course it will send a lot of people back to read the work of Marcel Detienne. I think, particularly the Gardens of Adonis. I think, and it always struck me as strange that methodology seemed to be truncated in the 1990s, in at least in the English-speaking world. It had seemed to be so fruitful, and then just seemed to disappear from around about, well, from perhaps 9/11. I think it disappeared. Not a coincidence. One last question I think we have, if that's all right with you, to bring us up to the hour, from my esteemed co-director of the Critical Antiquities Network, Tristan.
Thanks for squeezing me in, Ben. I feel like we're taxing our audience here, but I just wanted to ask you about whether there may be a place to talk about philia here. And I mean, this interest is personal because I'm all about Aristotle and philia in the sense that I find it very generative. So, you know, in one respect, philia is very schematic in Aristotle because he wants to divide it between pleasurable and virtuous and, you know, utility or use, friendship. But in some respects, it's much more complicated because in actual friendships, you see a kind of entanglement between several of these forms of friendship, I think, and paradigmatically, I think, actually, in the male-female husband and wife relationship, he talks about an entanglement of pleasure and virtue if the individuals are virtuous and this kind of thing. But anyway, so I was just wondering whether philia we could see as some kind of more capacious mode of sensuality than even Eros. And maybe that there's a significance for a phenomenological thinking of sensuality for the fact that that philia precisely isn't deified, and so it kind of drives us deeper into the kind of relational phenomenological dimensions of sensuality. Not that, you know, configuring desire as Eros precludes that totally, but more, you know, I guess it gives it a different kind of inflection than talking about it in terms of Eros. So those are my thoughts and my question.
It's an immense question, Tristan, and you know that. Well, I listened to you about the way you map the Aristotelian possibilities, let's say, and I know that also, you know, it's part of the controversial kind of way of speaking, let's say. I was alluding to what is part of that is you know, an allegedly stark difference between Eros and philia. Now, I would like, in a sense, to take two extreme textual places, perhaps, to come towards you. And once again, I'd like to hear you on Aristotle. One is Plutarch, because I think that Plutarch is really someone who, in the Erotikos, tries to succeed in creating this superior synthesis of conjugal philia, which is also erotic and sexual. And there, everything, in a sense, has to come together. Has to come together, and has to come together as a great wave of passion. In other words, there is no separation. There must be no separation between conjugality with all the sociability that comes with it and the erotic. And one of the interesting things that we learn precisely in this text is that someone like Plutarch says, and this is why philotes in Homer means erotic interaction. So if we need one point of view in order to attenuate the distinction between Eros and all the semantic field of philia, philotes, philein, etc., we find it in that particular work by Plutarch, which I find is extremely, extremely important. But in a sense, I would like to go back then from Plutarch to our cinematographic reading of the Odyssey, because, you know, conjugality is full of sensuality, because if you are nice and kind, let me talk, you know, our present language. If you are considerate, if you are attentive, if you recognize the state of mind of the person, if you are grateful, if you are gentle, all the virtues of an interesting way of being together nicely That is sensuality too. This is why, you know, kisses. If one has to focus on kisses, there is an anthropology of the kiss to write, because, you know, kisses can be precisely the non-erotic things that men do with boys in Plato's Republic, but kisses, you know, when Penelope throws her hand at that neck that has been all embellished by Athena and kisses him, what is this? This is conjugality. This is the familiarity, tenderness, sweetness of conjugality, but it's still a kiss. And the kiss, you know, we know what Longus makes about kisses, what Ovid tells us about kisses. Kiss is erotic, it's arousing, it's, you know, you know what I'm talking about, because there is a knowledge of how the body works. I mean, these people construct, stylize, encode, but there are limits to the invention. So, you know, embracing, caressing, kisses is erotic, and at the same time is conjugal. So, you know, conjugal is not just let's go to bed and make a child. Is, you know, day after day, squeezing, looking, smiling, smelling, you know, making yourself agreeable in the eyes of the person. So I would say that if I take this sort of shortcut, Plutarch, Homer, I see a hyper-erotic marriage, which is another of, you know, the lines of argumentation that is very dear to me, because you cannot separate marriage from the erotic. It's absurd. Look at 3 vases and you can see that scenes of marriage have Eros, you know, fleeting around. And you cannot just perform the social function of marriage without sex, because marriage is about, you know, socially contributing or making possible the social reproduction of society, and this requires sex. And in order to have children, you need pleasure and desire, and women too have to have pleasure. We haven't gotten into that other chapter, which is that precisely physically, and this is where the domains of knowledge are important. This is where we have to read the physicians, medical writers, always together with, of course, all the historical precautions. But this model of, you know, female pleasure has been analogous to male pleasure, and therefore the idea that without pleasure on both sides, there is no seminal fluid that can mix up and result in a conception. It's huge. If we really take this idea out of Hippocrates, and then we put it in, even hypothetically, in the context of culture at large, it means that you must have women's pleasure and women's desire to have children. And therefore, Eros is the protagonist of marriage. And when we read the Odyssey, this is exactly what happens. You know, good old Penelope, you know, look at the dreams, look at how she dreams of Odysseus, look at how, you know, she handles also the suitors, because, you know, she never says no. So,
thank you.
So, you know, philia, I think, is potentially blending, especially in certain contexts, is potentially blending with Eros, and especially in the conjugal context, blends with Eros, and of course in the male homosensual love, as I like to call it. Well, you know, it's all about that. It's all precisely what happens in that language of sensuous, touchy friendship that can create this bodily intimacy. Because once again, if we are not obsessed with penetration, perhaps we see other gestures, other forms of proximity, other forms of flirtation. I mean, look in the symposium, all this dance between, and I sit here and I sit there. The symposium is a highly, highly central text from beginning to end.
Yeah. We'll talk about Aristotle another time.
I will listen to you. Honestly.
That's very gracious. That's very gracious.
No. Looking forward, really. Because I have a sort of a very old enmity. There is a very old enmity between Aristotle's thinking and logic on gender.
Probably healthy. It's probably
no,
healthy.
That's that. I'm curious.
Great. Well, let's wrap up there. Thanks so much, Giulia. We really appreciate this paper and contributing so wonderfully to the workshop. And thanks for your time. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And we look forward to seeing you next month. I'll quickly mention, I should have mentioned it at the beginning, the Critical Antiquities Network now has a website. So there, all of the schedules for the workshop are available. It's just criticalantiquities.org. So hopefully it makes it easier for people to access the schedule, register for Zoom and that kind of thing. But yeah, again, thank you, Giulia, and we'll see everyone next month, we hope, for Dimitri Kasimis from UChicago, for Aristotle, I think. Thanks again.